Hi, I'm Doug, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I built a modern 2-tray inbox. As a quick overview, the front rail, decorative sides, and back rails are made from Sapele and feature brass accents. The inner sides, back, and bottom are made from hard maple and maple MDF plywood. Almost all the pieces need to be around a 1/4 inch thick, so I resawed some at the bandsaw and some at the table saw. Using the only piece of 3/8 inch stock in the build, I ripped the back and front rails for the 2 trays. The inner sides and the decorative sides are both the same length, so I made all those cuts using a stop block on my table saw sled. After that, I jumped right into a more interesting part of the build, scroll sawing the design for the sides. I put the 4 decorative side blanks together and wrapped them with blue painter's tape. Using spray adhesive, I applied the design to the top of the stack. I also prepared the inner sides at this point, but I won't get to cutting them out until later. I'm going to tackle the cuts on my Wen scroll saw. I wasn't sure how it would hold up to cutting hardwood an inch thick, but both the saw and the Olsen precision ground blades I used held up great. Thanks for the blades, Dad. If you end up wanting to make this build, I have plans for sale on my website that include patterns for both the decorative and inner sides, as well as a full cut list and detailed steps. If you take your time and use a sharp blade, there'll be very little to clean up after these cuts are made. After that, I brought it over to the bandsaw for the outside cuts. In hindsight, I could have cut the whole design out on the scroll saw, and I think I would have ended up with less sanding. Regardless, at this point, I also cut out the maple sides. My drill press gets a lot of use in my shop, not just for drilling holes in wood and metal, but also as a spindle sander. And if you move the drum up and down while sanding, it's no longer just a spindle sander, it's an oscillating spindle sander. After cleaning up the cuts at the drill press and belt sander, I marked the holes that would eventually accept brass pins. Over at the drill press, I drilled out those 2 holes through all 4 sides. At this point, I removed the blue tape as well as the pattern. If you have any stubborn adhesive left, denatured alcohol does a great job of removing that. With the decorative sides prepared, I could turn my attention back to the inner sides over at the bandsaw. The notches in the maple sides should be cut to fit the front and back rail. I used the actual rails to gauge my progress and get a nice fit. I then sanded the sides to the template over at the belt and disc sander. The sides with the feet were a little harder to clean up using just the sanding equipment, so I broke out a card scraper as well as various files to help with the sanding. I did a quick sanding on all the inner sides and decorative sides on the belt sander. If you are wondering, I keep an 80 grit disc on my sander and a 120 grit belt. Next, it was time to cut the grooves in the sides and back that would accept the tray bottom. Since the sides have a foot sticking out, I had to get a little creative. I made an attachment for my table saw sled that had a straight edge with both the front and the back cut away to give clearance for the feet. I added some toggle clamps that I had, but I could have just used a push block as well. I got the positioning set up and then tested it using a sample piece of maple. Next, I had to choose which faces would make the insides of my tray. After they were marked, all that was left was to cut out the grooves. The small kerf on my blade was actually all I needed since the plywood itself was so thin. Using the sled, I cut the plywood down to size. I really wasn't worried about making cuts with the grain, but I did add blue painter's tape before I made the cross cuts. This helps with minimizing tear out. I reused the jig from earlier to put the rabbet the whole way around the bottom. The material that was left needed to fit in the groove that I cut in the sides and back. Other than sanding, the only other detail on the back piece is a roundover across the top. This was quickly formed using a hand plane, a file, and some sandpaper. After that, I cut the back rails a little closer to final length, still leaving them a bit long. I also went ahead and sanded the backs and rails prior to the first glue up. Now, I took the assembly in 4 glue ups. The first was the easiest, gluing the back rail to the tray back. A little glue and some clamps were all that were needed. A great tip when you have squeeze out like this is just to use a normal straw. When you push it along the corner, it picks up the glue. After the glue dried, I sanded the bottom of the assembly to remove any extra glue there. I took some time to sand the parts and refine the fit of the tray bottom to make sure everything would go together smoothly when I got to glue up. Using 2 framing squares, I established the location of the riser pins. I drilled holes in the 2 sides from the bottom tray, and using files, I formed an indent in the top sides that would eventually sit on the risers. I also marked the height on a drill bit that let me know how tall the risers would need to be. With the back rail already in place and the grooves all cut, the second glue up was fairly straightforward. The last piece I needed to make was the front rail, and it needed a small rabbet to accept the tray bottom. First, I cut the pieces fairly close to their final size before marking where the rabbet needed to be. I used that line to set up the depth of my router bit, and after some test cuts to fine-tune the fit, I ran both rails over the router. After cutting the rabbet, I marked where the sides started and stopped. Then I removed the little part near the rabbet that doesn't extend through the sides. Earlier in the project, I made a mistake by cutting the groove for the bottom too low on the sides and back. They should have been cut so the bottom would be flush with this front rail. Instead, I aligned them with the bottom of the sides, which left this front rail proud of the tray bottom. Using a combination of the belt sander, a rasp, a multi-tool, and some files, I sloped the front rail to meet the tray bottom while still keeping the full 3/8" height on the front. This third glue up was just attaching the front rail. I used an extra piece along the top edge so I could apply the pressure to the rabbet where the 2 pieces joined together. After the glue dried, I used a pull saw to cut the rails close to flush and then finished flushing them up with sanding. I touched up a few spots on the decorative sides with a Dremel and a sanding drum attachment, and after that, I prepared the sides for glue up with some hand sanding and file work. I was really worried about squeeze out in those decorative patterns, so I primarily ran glue on the bottom edge and then used some super glue to tack higher up on the design. The added benefit was the piece cured in place very quickly, allowing me to keep working. I did have a little squeeze out to clean up, so again, I used a straw to remove it. Using blue painter's tape, I marked 3/4 up on a drill bit and drilled out all the holes for the pins. I then marked out the brass rod every 7/8 inch so the pins would protrude from the holes after they were fully seated. I cut all the pieces of rod into a container, which was a tip I saw online, but I can't remember where I saw it. If you forget to scuff up the brass rod before cutting the pieces, just use 2 pieces of sandpaper to rub them all together and they'll scuff up fine. Using superglue, I tapped in the brass pins. You can easily hear when the brass has hit the bottom of the hole because the sound changes. I used the disc sander to sand them almost flush and then the belt sander to get them fully flush. The final piece that needed to be made for this build are the brass risers that keep the second tray suspended above the first. This is the part of the build I had to learn the most honestly. I had never attempted to polish brass before. I had 3/16" stock, but the hole I drilled was 11/64, so I had to make the rod narrower before I could even form the pins. I set my calipers using a drill bit, and then I used a hand drill and my belt sander to remove the most material. I had the drill spinning the opposite direction to the sandpaper so I could maintain control while I did this. Once my caliper said I was close, I moved it over to the drill press and finished getting it to the correct diameter with a file. I tried a number of approaches, but the final pin I made came out the best, so I'll show you that. After shaping the bottom with a file, I used sandpaper, working my way up through several grits the whole way to 2000. After that, I used fine steel wool, and the brass really started to look nice. I was curious just how far using a brass polish like Brasso could take it, so I tried that as well. Here is the pin at this stage compared to the other pin I made with polishing. You can see it didn't have quite the mirror finish yet, so I took it a step further. I don't have a polisher, so I bought polishing wheels I could chuck into my drill press, and I used first green and then blue polishing compound from Harbor Freight to polish the pin. Now you can see here's the final result. Before finishing, I did a final sanding up to 320 grit and then wiped down the trays with a tack cloth. The finishing process was interesting. I mean, it started out okay, just applying oil like you'd expect. But then, well, can you tell what happened here? Okay. If you guessed that I knocked over the can of Danish oil onto my work surface, myself, and the floor, well, then you guessed correctly. Regardless of the mishap, I really enjoyed using the Danish oil. It really drew out the beautiful grain pattern and was easy to apply. I was able to pour it into the detail areas and just move the workpiece around to get the oil to hit all those tight inside corners. I did wipe off the excess, but most of it soaked in, so I wasn't left with odd areas of extra finish. The next day, I hit it lightly with 600 grit, then 1500, then 2000. It was probably overkill, but man, those outer sides are silky smooth now. For the last step, I used a dab of superglue to glue the risers into the trays. And then they were finished. I am thrilled with how this project turned out. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and consider subscribing if you'd like more content like this. For folks that follow me on Instagram, they actually got to see a lot of behind the scenes pictures and footage before this video even came out. So if that's the type of thing you'd like to see, head over to DN Handcrafted on Instagram and give me a follow. Thanks so much for watching.